The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Preservation Archive in Portland, Maine, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the meticulous work happening inside. Sarah Mitchell, a 38-year-old photograph restoration specialist, sat hunched over her workstation, her eyes fixed on the deteriorated image displayed on her high-resolution monitor. The photograph had arrived 3 weeks earlier, part of a collection donated by the estate of Eleanor Hartwell, a woman who had passed away at 97, leaving behind boxes of family memorabilia that her distant relatives had no interest in keeping. The donation had come through the Historical Society, as it often did, another treasure trove of forgotten memories waiting to be catalogued and preserved. Most items were standard fare: military service records from World War I, birth certificates yellowed with age, postcards from summer vacations at the beach. But this particular photograph had caught Sarah's attention immediately. It was a wedding portrait dated 1902, mounted on thick cardboard backing that had warped and discolored over the decades. The image itself was badly faded, with water damage creating ghostly stains across the lower third of the composition. Sarah had been working in photograph restoration for 15 years, ever since completing her master's degree in archival science at Boston University. She had developed a reputation for her patient, methodical approach and her ability to coax details from images that others had deemed too damaged to save. Her workspace reflected this dedication: shelves lined with reference books on photographic processes, chemical treatments carefully labeled and stored, and multiple monitors displaying various stages of digital restoration projects. The wedding photograph showed a young couple posed in the formal style typical of turn-of-the-century portrait photography. The groom stood rigid and unsmiling, his dark suit pressed and proper, his hair slicked back with pomade. His hand rested possessively on the shoulder of his bride, who sat in an ornate chair beside him. The bride wore a high-necked white dress with elaborate lace detailing, her hair swept up in the Gibson girl style that had been fashionable in those years. What had initially drawn Sarah's attention was the bride's expression, or rather, the lack of one. While period photographs rarely captured genuine smiles due to the long exposure times required, there was something particularly haunting about this woman's face. Her eyes seemed to stare past the camera, unfocused and distant, as if she were looking at something only she could see. The photographer's mark was barely visible in the corner: Henderson Studio, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Sarah had made a note to research the studio later, knowing that understanding the photographer's techniques and typical style could help inform her restoration decisions. The cardboard backing bore a handwritten inscription in faded ink: Thomas and Constance Whitmore, June 14, 1902. Sarah had begun the restoration process by creating high-resolution scans of the original photograph, capturing every detail at 1200 dots per inch. This initial scan revealed the extent of the damage. The emulsion had separated from the paper base in several places, creating areas of loss where the image had simply disappeared. The water damage had left brown stains that obscured significant portions of the composition, and decades of exposure to light had faded the contrast, rendering the subjects as pale ghosts against a barely distinguishable background. The first stage of restoration involved careful digital cleaning, removing the surface dirt and stains that obscured the underlying image. Sarah worked slowly, using specialized software to analyze the photograph pixel by pixel, determining which marks were damage and which were original details. She adjusted the contrast gradually, bringing out the tonal range without introducing artificial sharpness that would make the restoration obvious. It was painstaking work that required intense concentration and a deep understanding of both historical photographic processes and modern digital techniques. As the image began to emerge from beneath the layers of time and damage, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn into the mystery of the couple's story. The studio setting was elaborate, with painted backdrops suggesting a garden scene complete with artificial flowers and decorative columns. This level of production indicated that the Whitmores had been willing to pay for an expensive portrait session, suggesting they were people of some means. The groom's clothing confirmed this impression. His suit was well-tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and a gold watch chain glinted at his vest. But it was the bride who continued to capture Sarah's attention. As the restoration progressed and more details became visible, Sarah noticed small things that seemed inconsistent with the carefully staged opulence of the scene. The bride's dress, while beautiful, appeared slightly too large for her frame, as if it had been made for someone else or perhaps had been worn by multiple people before her. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, seemed work-roughened and red, not the soft hands of a woman of leisure. And there was something about her posture, a tension in her shoulders and neck, that suggested discomfort beyond the normal rigidity of posed photography. Sarah had worked through lunch that day, sustained by cold coffee and the professional satisfaction of seeing a damaged image slowly return to clarity. By mid-afternoon, she had made significant progress on the upper portion of the photograph, revealing details in the couple's faces and clothing that had been invisible in the original condition. The groom's features had become clear: a stern face with a heavy mustache, deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into the camera with intensity. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, perhaps 10 or 15 years older than his bride. The restoration of the bride's face required particular care. The water damage had been most severe in this area, and Sarah worked methodically to reconstruct the missing details by analyzing similar areas of intact emulsion and using historical references to guide her decisions. As the bride's features emerged, Sarah felt an unexpected emotional response. The young woman in the photograph couldn't have been more than 18 or 19 years old. Her face, now visible in increasing detail, showed delicate features that would have been considered beautiful by the standards of the era. But her eyes held an expression that Sarah found deeply troubling, a mixture of resignation and barely concealed fear that no amount of formal posing could entirely disguise. By 4 o'clock. Sarah had completed the restoration of the couple's faces and upper bodies and had begun working on the lower portion of the photograph, where the water damage was most extensive. This section had appeared almost completely black in the original scan, the details lost beneath layers of staining and fading. Sarah applied a series of digital filters, carefully adjusting the levels and curves to separate the original photographic information from the damage. It was slow work, requiring multiple passes and constant comparison with the surrounding areas to ensure consistency. As Sarah worked on revealing the bride's hands and lap, something unexpected began to emerge from the darkness. At first, she thought it was an artifact of the restoration process, a false detail created by the aggressive contrast adjustments. But as she refined the image further, the detail persisted and became clearer. There appeared to be something dark around the bride's wrists, something that didn't match the lace and fabric of her dress. Sarah leaned closer to her monitor, her heart rate increasing as she realized what she was seeing. The rain outside had intensified, and the archive's fluorescent lights hummed in the sudden late afternoon darkness. Sarah's colleague, Marcus Chin, a document specialist, looked up from his own work at the next station. He noticed Sarah's rigid posture and the way she had frozen in place, her hands still on the mouse but no longer moving. Marcus walked over to Sarah's workstation, concerned by her unusual stillness. He asked if everything was all right, but Sarah didn't immediately respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen, specifically on the area she had been working to restore. Marcus followed her gaze and leaned in to examine the image more closely. What he saw made him understand Sarah's reaction. There, emerging from the digital reconstruction with increasing clarity, was something that shouldn't have been part of a wedding portrait. Around the bride's wrists, partially concealed by the folds of her dress but now undeniably visible, was what appeared to be a length of chain. Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She explained that she had thought it was damage or an artifact at first, but the more she refined the restoration, the clearer it became. It was definitely there in the original photograph, a real physical object captured by the camera in 1902. Marcus suggested that it might be some kind of bracelet or decorative jewelry, but even as he said it, both of them knew that explanation didn't fit. The object in the photograph was too crude, too industrial-looking to be jewelry. It appeared to be an actual chain, the kind used for securing livestock or equipment, not adorning a bride on her wedding day. Sarah made a decision. She would complete the restoration of this section, revealing whatever the full image had to show, and then they would need to research the story behind this photograph. Something deeply wrong had happened to Constance Whitmore, and after more than a century, someone was finally seeing the evidence she had left behind. The young woman in the photograph had sat for this portrait knowing that the chain would be visible, that it would be captured and preserved on film. Perhaps she had hoped that someday, someone would notice and understand what it meant. Sarah arrived at the archive early the next morning, having barely slept. The image of Constance Whitmore's face had haunted her dreams, those resigned eyes staring out across more than a century, carrying a message that had gone unread for generations. She had made coffee at home but forgot to drink it, leaving the full mug on her kitchen counter in her haste to return to work. The November morning was cold and gray, with frost coating the cars parked along the street and her breath visible in small clouds as she hurried from the parking lot to the building's entrance. The archive wouldn't officially open for another 2 hours, but Sarah had a key and often came in early when working on particularly challenging projects. This morning, however, her motivation wasn't professional satisfaction or technical challenge. She needed to see the complete image, to finish the restoration and understand exactly what Constance Whitmore had wanted someone to discover. Sarah had worked on thousands of historical photographs during her career, treating each one with professional care and interest, but this was different. This felt personal, urgent, as if the young woman in the photograph had been waiting specifically for Sarah to find her. Sarah settled at her workstation and brought up the project files. She had saved her work at multiple stages the previous day, and now she opened the most recent version, showing the photograph as she had left it. The upper portion was fully restored. Thomas Whitmore's stern face looking out with that intense, possessive gaze, and Constance's delicate features marked by that troubling expression. The restoration of the lower section had been interrupted when she and Marcus had discovered the chain, but enough detail was visible to confirm that what they had seen was real. Sarah resumed her work, applying careful adjustments to bring out the remaining details obscured by water damage and fading. As she worked, more of the chain became visible. It ran around both of Constance's wrists, the links clearly defined once the surrounding damage was cleared away. The chain appeared to continue beneath the folds of her dress, suggesting it was secured somehow out of view of the camera. Sarah felt a growing sense of horror as the full implications became clear. This woman had been physically restrained during her wedding portrait, chained like a prisoner, and the photograph had been taken and preserved as if this were normal, acceptable. The restoration took another 3 hours of intensive work. By the time Sarah was satisfied that she had recovered all the details that could be salvaged from the damaged original, it was mid-morning and other staff members had begun arriving. The final restored image showed the wedding portrait in remarkable clarity considering the condition of the source material. Every detail was now visible: the elaborate studio setting, the expensive clothing, Thomas Whitmore's domineering presence, and Constance's subtle signs of distress that had been hidden by time and damage. And there, undeniable and disturbing, the chain around her wrists. Sarah saved the completed restoration and began creating documentation. Standard archive procedure required that she prepare a full report detailing the restoration process, the techniques used, and any significant findings. This report would normally be filed away with the archived materials, read perhaps by a handful of researchers over the years. But Sarah knew this case needed more attention. She prepared her documentation with unusual care, including multiple views of the chain detail and extensive notes about its implications. Marcus arrived at his usual time and immediately came over to see the finished restoration. They stood together in silence for several minutes, studying the image on Sarah's monitor. Finally, Marcus suggested that they should research the couple, find out what had happened to them and whether there were any records that might explain the chain. Sarah agreed, grateful to have someone else who understood the importance of this discovery. They decided to divide the research work, with Marcus focusing on official records while Sarah tried to trace the photograph's provenance through the Hartwell estate. Sarah began by examining the other materials that had been donated along with the photograph collection. Eleanor Hartwell's estate had included several boxes of papers, most of which were still waiting to be properly catalogued. Sarah requested access to these boxes and spent the rest of the morning carefully sorting through their contents. Most items were from the 20th century, documents related to Eleanor's own life and the lives of her immediate family. But in the third box, Sarah found a leather-bound journal with pages yellowed and brittle with age. The journal had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, Margaret Hartwell, and the entries dated from 1898 through 1906. Sarah handled the fragile volume with extreme care, knowing that the information contained within might provide crucial context for the wedding photograph. She began reading the entries chronologically, learning about Margaret's daily life in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, at the turn of the century. The entries were typical of personal journals from the period: descriptions of social calls, notes about household management, observations about the weather and local events. But as Sarah progressed through the journal, she found entries that mentioned Thomas Whitmore. Margaret had known him, it seemed, as he was involved in business dealings with her husband. The entries painted a picture of Thomas as a wealthy merchant who had made his fortune in the textile trade, importing cloth from Europe and selling it throughout New England. He was described as shrewd and ambitious, a man who drove hard bargains and was known for his insistence on controlling every detail of his business operations. Margaret's tone when writing about Thomas was neutral but not warm, suggesting a relationship based on business necessity rather than genuine friendship. Then, in March of 1902, Margaret made a more detailed entry about Thomas Whitmore that caught Sarah's full attention. Margaret wrote about a conversation she had overheard at a ladies' society meeting, where several women had been discussing Thomas's plans to marry. Apparently, Thomas had traveled to New York City the previous month and returned with a bride-to-be, a young immigrant woman he had encountered through some business connection. Margaret noted that the announcement had surprised many in Portsmouth's social circles, as Thomas was known to be particular about maintaining his social position, and it was unusual for a man of his standing to marry someone without established family connections. Sarah continued reading, her sense of unease growing. In April, Margaret wrote about seeing Thomas and his fiancée at a church service. She described the young woman as very pale and quiet, noting that she seemed frightened and barely spoke even when directly addressed. Margaret had felt concerned enough to mention it to her husband, who had dismissed her worries, saying that Thomas's private affairs were none of their business. The entries from May made brief mentions of wedding preparations, with Margaret noting that Thomas had spared no expense and seemed determined to display his acquisition of a beautiful young bride as he would display any other valuable possession. The entry dated June 15, 1902, the day after the wedding, was longer and more detailed than most. Margaret had attended the wedding ceremony and the reception that followed, and she recorded her observations with unusual candor. She described the ceremony as lavish but strangely joyless, with the bride moving through the proceedings like a person in a trance. Margaret had noticed that Constance never smiled, never showed any sign of happiness, and seemed to shrink away whenever Thomas touched her. During the reception, Margaret had tried to speak with the new Mrs. Whitmore, but Thomas had intervened, saying that his wife was too overwhelmed to engage in much conversation. But it was Margaret's final observation in that entry that made Sarah's hands shake as she held the journal. Margaret wrote that she had noticed something disturbing during the wedding reception. As Constance had reached for a glass of water, her sleeve had slipped back slightly, revealing what appeared to be a mark or bruise around her wrist. Margaret had thought little of it at the moment, but later, reflecting on everything she had observed about Thomas and his young bride, she had felt a growing certainty that something was very wrong in that household. She had written that she feared for Constance's safety but felt powerless to intervene, as a wife was legally the property of her husband and no one would interfere in a man's management of his own household. Sarah photographed the relevant journal pages with her phone, knowing that Marcus would need to see this evidence. She continued reading through the remaining entries, finding occasional mentions of the Whitmores over the following years. Margaret had seen Constance occasionally at social events, always accompanied by Thomas, always silent and withdrawn. In 1903, Margaret noted that Constance appeared to be expecting a child, and in 1904, she mentioned hearing that Constance had given birth to a daughter. But the entries became less frequent after that, and there were no more detailed observations about Constance's situation. The final mention of the Whitmores came in an entry from October 1906. Margaret wrote simply that she had heard Constance Whitmore had died, reportedly from complications of pneumonia. She noted that Thomas had not held a public funeral and that the burial had been private, attended only by Thomas himself and the minister. Margaret's entry ended with a single sentence that Sarah found heartbreaking in its restrained sadness. "I fear that poor girl never knew a single day of happiness in this world." Sarah closed the journal carefully and sat in silence, processing what she had read. The wedding photograph now had a context, a story that made the chain around Constance's wrists both shocking and sadly logical. Thomas Whitmore had not just been a controlling husband, he had been Constance's captor, keeping her physically restrained even during their wedding portrait session. The photograph was evidence of abuse, captivity, and the absolute powerlessness of women in an era when they had no legal rights independent of their husbands. Marcus returned to the archive in the early afternoon with results from his research into official records. He had found Thomas and Constance's marriage certificate, which listed Constance's maiden name as Kozlov and her place of birth as somewhere in Russia, though the specific location was listed only as Russian Empire, without further detail. Her age was recorded as 18, while Thomas had been 36 at the time of their marriage. Marcus had also located Thomas's death certificate from 1922, showing that he had died at age 56 from a heart condition. More significantly, Marcus had found Constance's death certificate from 1906, which confirmed Margaret's journal entry. Constance had died at age 22, just 4 years after her wedding. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but Marcus had found a notation that the death had been reported by Thomas Whitmore himself, with no doctor's examination recorded. Sarah shared what she had discovered in Margaret Hartwell's journal, and together they began to piece together Constance's story. She had been a young Russian immigrant, possibly brought to America through some labor contract or immigration scheme that Thomas had exploited. He had essentially purchased her, using legal marriage as a cover for what amounted to human trafficking and slavery. The chain in the photograph was literal physical evidence of this captivity, shocking in its openness. Thomas had apparently felt no need to hide the chain during the formal portrait session, suggesting either that he believed no one would question his right to restrain his wife or that he simply didn't care what others thought. The question that haunted both Sarah and Marcus was why Constance's wrists had been chained during her wedding portrait. Marcus suggested that perhaps she had tried to escape or resist, and Thomas had chained her to ensure her compliance during the public ceremony and photograph session. Sarah thought it might have been even simpler than that. Thomas might have kept Constance chained as a matter of routine, and the photographer had simply accepted this as part of the setup, perhaps not wanting to lose a wealthy client's business by raising objections. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Marcus discussed what they should do with their discovery. The photograph and Margaret's journal were powerful evidence of a historical crime, a documented case of domestic slavery and abuse from an era when such treatment of women was common enough to go unremarked. They agreed that the story deserved wider attention, that Constance Whitmore's suffering should not remain buried in an archive. Sarah began preparing a detailed case study, documenting the photograph restoration, the journal entries, and the official records they had uncovered. She planned to submit it to several historical journals and to reach out to historians who specialized in women's history and immigration history from the early 20th century. Within a week of Sarah's initial report being distributed to relevant historical societies and women's history research groups, the story of Constance Whitmore's wedding photograph had attracted significant attention. A professor from Yale University specializing in immigration history reached out, as did a documentary filmmaker who had been working on a project about human trafficking in early 20th century America. The New England Historical Society requested permission to display the restored photograph in an upcoming exhibition about women's lives in the Progressive Era. Media outlets began calling the archive, seeking interviews and additional information. Sarah found herself thrust into an unfamiliar role as spokesperson for a historical investigation that had grown far beyond her initial restoration work. She gave careful interviews to journalists, always emphasizing that Constance's story was not unique, that countless women had suffered similar fates in an era when they had virtually no legal protections or rights. The photograph was remarkable only because it provided such clear visual evidence of what had been common but usually hidden from public view and historical record. Marcus had continued his research into official records and had made several significant discoveries. He found census records showing that Thomas Whitmore's household in 1900 included Thomas himself, listed as head of household and merchant, and one female servant, unnamed, listed only as domestic help from Russia. This was almost certainly Constance, already living in Thomas's home 2 years before their marriage, her status ambiguous and her situation apparently unremarkable to the census taker. By the 1910 census, taken 4 years after Constance's death, Thomas's household included a young girl named Catherine Whitmore, age 6, listed as Thomas's daughter. There was also a new female servant, this one identified as Mary Sullivan, age 17, from Ireland. The pattern that emerged from these records was disturbing. Thomas Whitmore had apparently made a practice of acquiring young immigrant women, vulnerable and without resources or connections, and bringing them into his household under various pretenses. The legal marriage to Constance may have been unusual, possibly forced by circumstances that the historical record didn't reveal. Perhaps Constance had become pregnant, and Thomas had decided that legitimizing the child would be more convenient than dealing with the complications of an illegitimate birth. Or perhaps he had wanted the social respectability that came with having a wife, while still maintaining complete control over a woman who had no ability to resist or escape. A graduate student from Boston University, working on her dissertation about Eastern European immigration to New England, contacted Sarah with information about the broader context of Constance's story. She explained that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there had been numerous schemes that targeted young women from Russia, Poland, and other Eastern European countries. These women were promised legitimate work in America, usually as domestic servants or factory workers, but many found themselves essentially enslaved, trapped in situations where their labor was exploited and they had no way to seek help or escape. Some were forced into prostitution, others into unpaid domestic servitude, and many into coerced marriages with men who saw them as property rather than as human beings with rights and dignity. The graduate student had found records of several organizations that had worked to help these women, including immigrant aid societies and women's protective leagues. She shared documentation showing that Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where Thomas Whitmore had lived, had been one of several port cities where such exploitation was known to occur. Ships arriving from Europe would discharge immigrant passengers, many of whom were met by labor agents or supposed employers who would take them to work situations that often turned out to be far different from what had been promised. Young women traveling alone were particularly vulnerable, as they often had limited English skills, no knowledge of American laws or customs, and no connections to help them if they encountered problems. Sarah and Marcus worked with the graduate student to search for any records of Constance's arrival in America. They checked immigration records at Ellis Island, the most common entry point for European immigrants during that period. The search was complicated by the fact that names were often misspelled or anglicized by immigration officials, and records from that era were incomplete. But eventually, they found what appeared to be Constance's entry record. A young woman named Konstantia Kozlova had arrived in New York in January 1900, traveling alone on a ship from Hamburg, Germany. The record listed her age as 16, her occupation as domestic servant, and her destination as employment in Boston with a family whose name was illegible in the faded record. The timeline fit. Constance would have been in America for 2 years before appearing in Thomas Whitmore's household in the 1900 census, and 4 years before her marriage to him in 1902. What had happened to her during those first 2 years remained unknown, but it seemed likely that she had never reached the legitimate employment in Boston that had been her stated destination. Somehow, she had ended up in Thomas Whitmore's control, far from the immigrant communities in Boston where she might have found people who spoke her language or could have helped her. A retired police detective who had become interested in the case after reading about it in a regional newspaper contacted Sarah with an observation that had troubled him. He pointed out that Constance's death from pneumonia at age 22, while not impossible, was suspicious given the circumstances. Pneumonia was certainly a common killer in that era, but healthy young people usually survived with proper care. The fact that Thomas had reported the death himself, with no doctor's examination recorded, and that he had held only a private burial, suggested the possibility that Constance's death had not been from natural causes. The detective noted that in cases of domestic abuse resulting in death, it was not uncommon for husbands to claim their wives had died from illness, and in an era with limited medical examinations and death investigations, such claims were often accepted without question. This possibility led to more research into Thomas Whitmore's history and character. Marcus found business records showing that Thomas had been involved in several lawsuits during his lifetime, most of them related to business disputes where he was accused of sharp dealing or contract violations. Character witnesses in these cases had described him as ruthless, controlling, and vindictive, someone who believed that any advantage he could gain through legal means or otherwise was justified by his right to prosper. There were no records of criminal charges ever being filed against him, but several documents hinted at a reputation for cruelty and lack of scruples. The investigation also turned up information about Thomas's family background. He had come from a moderately successful merchant family in New Hampshire, but he had significantly expanded the family wealth through his own business dealings. He had never married before Constance, despite being in his mid-30s, an age when most men of his class and means would have been expected to have established a family. This suggested that perhaps no respectable woman had been willing to marry him, that his character and reputation had made him unsuitable despite his wealth. Marrying a powerless immigrant woman who could not refuse him would have solved this problem while allowing him to maintain complete control over his household. Sarah received a particularly significant piece of information from a local historian in Portsmouth who had been researching the Henderson studio, the photography business that had taken the Whitmore wedding portrait. The historian had found the studio's account ledgers from that period, which had survived in a private collection. The ledger entry for the Whitmore portrait session included an unusual notation. Beside the record of payment, the photographer had written a brief note: difficult sitting. Subject uncooperative. Additional time required. This cryptic comment suggested that Constance had resisted during the portrait session, that the photograph had not been taken smoothly. Perhaps she had refused to pose, or had been crying, or had otherwise made her distress visible enough that the photographer had noted it as an impediment to his work. The historian also shared something else she had found in her research. The Henderson studio had closed abruptly in 1904, just 2 years after taking the Whitmore portrait. The photographer, Samuel Henderson, had left Portsmouth suddenly, and there were vague newspaper references to some kind of scandal or controversy, though the specific details were never reported. The historian speculated that Henderson might have been troubled by what he had witnessed at the Whitmore portrait session, perhaps troubled enough that it affected his business or his willingness to continue working in Portsmouth's society. This was pure speculation, but it added another layer to the story, suggesting that at least one person besides Margaret Hartwell had noticed and been disturbed by what was happening to Constance Whitmore. As the investigation deepened, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about Constance as a real person, not just a historical figure or a subject in a photograph. She had been a teenager when she arrived in America, probably full of hopes for a better life than whatever circumstances she had left behind in Russia. Instead, she had found herself trapped in a nightmare, isolated in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language and had no one to help her. She had been forced to marry her captor, chained during her own wedding portrait, and then had lived for 4 more years in his household before dying under suspicious circumstances at age 22. The one small mercy in Constance's story was her daughter. Sarah and Marcus had tried to trace what had happened to Catherine Whitmore, the child Constance had given birth to in 1904. Census records showed Catherine living in Thomas's household through 1920, at which point she would have been 16 years old. After Thomas's death in 1922, the trail became harder to follow. Eventually, Marcus found a marriage record from 1925 showing that Catherine Whitmore had married a man named Robert Hayes in Portland, Maine, and had moved away from Portsmouth. This suggested that Catherine had survived her father's household and had managed to build an independent life after his death. Sarah reached out to genealogical researchers to see if they could trace Catherine's descendants. If Constance had living descendants, they deserved to know her story, to understand what their ancestor had endured. The genealogical search was complicated and time-consuming, but eventually, a connection was made. Catherine Hayes had had 3 children, and her line had continued through subsequent generations. One of her great-granddaughters, a woman named Jennifer Morrison living in Vermont, was located and contacted by the researchers. Jennifer had known almost nothing about her family history beyond her grandparents' generation. The story of Constance Whitmore came as a complete shock to her. She agreed to speak with Sarah by phone, and during their conversation, Jennifer shared something that added a poignant final detail to the investigation. Among her grandmother's possessions, carefully preserved and passed down through the family without anyone understanding its significance, was a small locked box. Jennifer had always been told it contained something that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother, but no one had ever found the key, and out of respect for the family history, no one had forced it open. After learning about Constance's story, Jennifer decided it was time to open the box. With Sarah on the phone, she carefully pried open the old lock. Inside was a collection of small items: a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, a handkerchief with embroidered initials that matched Constance's maiden name, and several pieces of paper covered in writing in what appeared to be Russian. Jennifer photographed these items and sent the images to Sarah, who forwarded them to the graduate student who had helped with the immigration research. The graduate student had connections with Russian-language scholars who could translate the documents. The translation, when it came back several days later, revealed that the papers were letters Constance had written but apparently never been able to send. They were addressed to family members in Russia, written in a mixture of Russian and broken English, describing her situation in desperate terms. She wrote about being brought to America under false promises, about being trapped in a house where she was not allowed to leave, about a man who had bought her and controlled every aspect of her life. The letters were heartbreaking in their simple, direct descriptions of suffering and their pleas for help that would never be answered. In one letter, she wrote about her daughter, expressing her love for the child and her terror that her daughter would suffer the same fate she had endured. The final letter, dated March 1906, just months before Constance's death, was particularly chilling. She wrote that she feared she would not live much longer, that Thomas had become increasingly violent, and that she worried constantly about what would happen to Catherine after she was gone. The letter ended with a sentence that Sarah would never forget: "I want someone to know that I was here, that I lived, that I tried to be free. Please remember me." The story of Constance Whitmore's wedding photograph and the investigation it had sparked became a significant case study in women's history and immigration history. Sarah's detailed documentation of the photograph restoration and the subsequent research was published in several academic journals and was featured in a prominent women's history magazine. The photograph itself, along with selections from Margaret Hartwell's journal and the translated letters from Constance's locked box, was displayed in an exhibition at the New England Historical Society titled Invisible Chains: Women's Stories of Survival and Resistance. The exhibition opened in late spring, 6 months after Sarah had first discovered the chain in the wedding photograph. The restored portrait was displayed prominently, with detailed explanatory text providing context about Constance's life, the historical circumstances that had made her captivity possible, and the legal and social structures that had failed to protect women like her. The curators had made the decision to display the photograph without obscuring or censoring the chain, believing that the visceral impact of seeing actual evidence of captivity was important for visitors to fully understand the reality of women's experiences in that era. Sarah attended the exhibition opening and found herself surrounded by historians, journalists, and members of the public who had been moved by Constance's story. Many visitors stood in front of the photograph for long periods, studying Constance's face and the visible chain, clearly trying to comprehend how such treatment of a human being could have been photographed and preserved as if it were normal. Several elderly women approached Sarah during the opening to share their own family stories of immigrant ancestors who had endured various forms of exploitation and abuse, stories that had been whispered about in families but never fully acknowledged or documented. Jennifer Morrison attended the exhibition opening with several members of her family, including her teenage daughter. They spent a long time looking at the photograph of their ancestor, and Jennifer later told Sarah that seeing Constance's face and understanding her story had given her a new sense of connection to her family history. She said that her daughter had been particularly affected by the exhibition and had decided to write her high school history research paper about immigrant women's experiences in early 20th century America, using Constance's story as a central example. The documentary filmmaker who had contacted Sarah earlier in the investigation had completed a short film about the case, which premiered at a regional film festival and subsequently was acquired by a streaming service for broader distribution. The film included interviews with Sarah, Marcus, and several of the historians who had contributed to the research, as well as dramatic readings of Margaret Hartwell's journal entries and Constance's letters. The filmmaker had chosen not to use actors to recreate scenes from Constance's life, instead focusing on the photograph itself and the process of uncovering the story it contained. This approach proved powerful, allowing viewers to focus on the real evidence and the careful detective work that had revealed Constance's experiences. Sarah gave numerous presentations about the case at historical societies, archives conferences, and university seminars. She always emphasized several key points. First, that Constance's story, while shocking in its details, was not unique. Countless women had suffered similar fates, but most left no evidence behind, no photographs or letters or journal entries to document their experiences. Second, that the photograph had survived only by chance, preserved in a family collection and eventually donated to an archive where someone with the skills and interest to properly restore it happened to work. How many other pieces of evidence had been lost or destroyed? How many women's stories had disappeared completely from the historical record? Third, and perhaps most important to Sarah, was the fact that Constance had made deliberate choices to leave evidence behind. She had allowed the chain to be photographed during her wedding portrait, knowing or hoping that someday someone would see it and understand its significance. She had written letters describing her situation, even though she had no way to send them, and had hidden them carefully in hopes they would be preserved. She had, in whatever small ways were available to her, resisted the complete erasure of her story. The historical investigation had not just uncovered Constance's suffering, it had honored her deliberate act of testimony. Marcus, meanwhile, had continued researching Thomas Whitmore's business dealings and had uncovered evidence that suggested Thomas may have been involved in a broader network of human trafficking and exploitation. Business correspondence and shipping records showed connections to several other merchants who were later convicted or accused of importing women and girls under fraudulent labor contracts. This discovery led to a larger research project examining the systematic nature of such exploitation in early 20th century New England, work that was still ongoing a year after the initial discovery of the chain in Constance's wedding photograph. The retired police detective who had raised questions about Constance's death worked with the local medical examiner's office to review the limited information available about deaths in Portsmouth during that period. While there was no way to conclusively determine what had actually caused Constance's death more than a century after the fact, the review of similar cases revealed a pattern of suspicious deaths of young immigrant women that had been recorded as natural causes without proper investigation. This historical review contributed to modern training materials for death investigators, illustrating how bias and indifference had historically allowed domestic violence and murder to go undetected and unpunished. Sarah found that working on Constance's case had changed her approach to her restoration work in fundamental ways. She now looked at every historical photograph with increased attention to details that might reveal untold stories, particularly stories of women and other marginalized people whose experiences had often been excluded from official histories. She began offering workshops for other archivists and restoration specialists, teaching them to look beyond the obvious subjects and compositions to notice the smaller details that might indicate suffering, resistance, or simply the reality of life for people whose voices were not typically preserved in historical records. The case also led to discussions within the archival community about ethical responsibilities when historical evidence of crimes or abuse was discovered. Should archives report historical crimes to modern authorities, even when all the parties involved were long dead and no prosecution was possible? Should disturbing images be displayed publicly, or did that risk re-traumatizing viewers or sensationalizing historical suffering? These were complex questions without easy answers, and Constance's case became a frequent reference point in ongoing professional discussions about archival ethics and public history. As the first anniversary of the discovery approached, Sarah worked with the New England Historical Society to plan a memorial event honoring Constance Whitmore and other women who had suffered similar fates. The event was held in Portsmouth, not far from where Thomas Whitmore's house had once stood. The house itself had been demolished decades earlier, but the site was marked with a newly installed historical marker describing Constance's story and acknowledging the suffering of immigrant women who had been exploited and abused during the period of mass immigration to America. Jennifer Morrison spoke at the memorial event, reading excerpts from her great-great-grandmother's letters and talking about what it meant to her family to finally know and honor this part of their history. She had brought her daughter, now 16, who had won a state history competition for her research paper about immigrant women's experiences. Jennifer spoke about the importance of preserving difficult histories, of not turning away from evidence of suffering even when it was uncomfortable to acknowledge. She said that knowing what Constance had endured made her appreciate the courage and resilience of all the women in her family line, women who had survived and persevered despite circumstances designed to break them. Sarah also spoke at the memorial, describing the technical work of photograph restoration but emphasizing the human responsibility that came with bringing lost images back to visibility. She showed comparison images of the wedding photograph as it had first appeared and as it looked after restoration, pointing out how the chain had been there all along, waiting for someone to see it. She talked about the privilege and responsibility of archival work, the fact that archivists and historians served as witnesses to the past and had obligations both to the people whose stories they preserved and to the modern public who needed to understand history fully and honestly. The memorial event included a moment of silence for Constance and all women who had suffered similar fates, followed by readings of the names of other known victims of human trafficking and exploitation in early 20th century New England. The list was long and certainly incomplete, as most victims had left no records of their existence or suffering. But speaking the names that were known, acknowledging that these had been real people with lives and stories, felt like an important act of remembrance and resistance to historical erasure. In the year following the discovery, Sarah had received letters and emails from people around the world who had been moved by Constance's story. Some shared their own family histories of immigration and struggle. Others expressed gratitude that someone had taken the time to investigate and honor one woman's experience instead of dismissing it as too distant or too minor to matter. Several young women wrote to say that learning about Constance had inspired them to study history, archival science, or women's studies, wanting to help uncover and preserve other untold stories. One letter particularly affected Sarah. It came from a woman in Russia who said that the name Kozlov was common in the region where her family came from. She couldn't prove any direct connection to Constance, but she said that knowing a woman from her country's past had left such powerful evidence of her suffering and her humanity made her feel connected across time and distance. The letter writer said that in Russia, as in America, women's stories had often been erased or ignored, and she was grateful that people like Sarah were working to bring those stories back to light. Sarah kept that letter on her desk, next to a small print of the restored wedding photograph. When she looked at the image now, she no longer saw just a technical restoration challenge or an interesting historical artifact. She saw Constance Whitmore, a real woman who had lived and suffered and loved her daughter and had desperately wanted to be free. She saw a woman who had been brave enough to leave evidence of her captivity, trusting that someday, someone would understand and care and remember. The chain in the photograph had become a powerful symbol, reproduced in educational materials and used in discussions about historical human trafficking, domestic abuse, and women's rights. But Sarah always tried to remind people that the chain was not the most important thing in the photograph. The most important thing was Constance's face, her eyes looking out across more than a century with an expression that asked to be seen, understood, and remembered as a human being who had mattered, who had existed, who had tried in whatever small ways she could to resist her captivity and testify to her experience. On the actual anniversary of discovering the chain, Sarah took a personal day from the archive. She drove to Portsmouth and visited the historical marker that had been installed near the site of Thomas Whitmore's former home. She stood there for a while, thinking about everything that had been learned over the past year and everything that remained unknown. She thought about Constance arriving in America as a teenager, full of hopes that had been so cruelly destroyed. She thought about the 4 years of captivity, the daughter Constance had loved and worried for, and the suspicious death at age 22. She thought about Catherine, who had survived and built a life and passed down the locked box with her mother's letters and personal items, preserving them even without understanding their full significance. Standing at that marker, Sarah made a private promise to Constance. She would continue her work, would continue looking for the hidden stories in historical photographs and documents, would continue working to ensure that people like Constance were not forgotten. Every photograph she restored, every archive collection she processed, she would approach with the understanding that behind the formal poses and faded images were real people whose experiences deserved to be known and honored. The story of a 1902 wedding photograph had changed Sarah's life and work in profound ways. It had led to important historical research, had sparked conversations about ethics and memory and justice, and had honored one woman's desperate attempt to leave evidence of her suffering and her humanity. Most importantly, it had ensured that Constance Whitmore was finally seen, acknowledged, and remembered. The chain that had bound her in life had become, through the accident of its preservation in a photograph and the careful work of restoration and research, a testament to her existence and her resistance. She had wanted someone to know she was there, that she had lived, that she had tried to be free. Now, more than a century after her death, thousands of people knew her name and her story. Her plea to be remembered had been answered,